The Joint Cultural Integration Center occupied the third tier of Verath Station's collaborative wing, a space that the station's architectural planning had designated for interspecies project work, and that the designation had equipped with the environmental versatility that interspecies work required. Atmospheric systems capable of maintaining multiple species' respiratory requirements simultaneously. Lighting that could be adjusted across spectral ranges that different visual systems preferred, and the acoustic calibration that allowed species with different auditory architectures to share a workspace without the sound of one species' conversation becoming the noise of another's. The center was functional. The center was practical. The center was, by the aesthetic standards of either species that occupied it, unremarkable, and the unremarkability was what made it work. A space whose neutrality allowed the people in it to focus on each other rather than on the space. Callum Oren was at his workstation in the archive's documentation section, reviewing the day's comparative analysis of verbal prosody, the musical qualities of speech that carried emotional and social information across both human and Kalithi communication systems. The analysis was the current phase of the Cultural Archive project, a granular examination of how the two species encoded meaning in the nonverbal qualities of their verbal communication. And the work required the specific kind of focused, detailed attention that Callum found genuinely engaging, which was fortunate because work that required focused attention from someone who did not find it engaging produced work of lesser quality. And the archive's quality was something he took personally. He was 31. He occupied his workstation with the comfortable, settled posture of someone who had been occupying it for 7 months, and whose body had negotiated with the station's ergonomic furniture the specific arrangement of compromises that long-term occupation required. He was 5'11", lean, built with the particular frame that intellectual work produced when the intellectual worker also maintained the physical activity that station life's recreational facilities provided, not athletic, not sedentary, but the functional middle ground of a person whose body served his mind's requirements, and whose mind's requirements included being healthy enough to sustain the focus that the work demanded. His face was open, expressive, carrying the particular quality of readability that people who worked in communication fields tended to possess, features that were animated by the thoughts behind them. A face that communicated what its owner was thinking with a transparency that was partly natural and partly professional. The occupational development of someone whose work involved reading and producing communicative signals, and who had refined both skills through years of practice. His eyes were brown, warm brown, carrying the attentive quality that communication specialists developed through years of careful observation, the eyes of someone who listened with his vision as much as his hearing. His hair was dark, slightly unruly, carrying the specific entropy that 7 months of station life and irregular grooming schedules produced. He was wearing the standard work clothing that the Integration Center provided, comfortable, professional, carrying the diplomatic neutrality that interspecies work clothing was designed to project. Vela Sorthenes occupied the adjacent workstation, because the project's seating arrangement placed collaborating partners in proximity, and because proximity was the arrangement that 7 months of collaboration had made natural rather than assigned. She was working on the corresponding Kalithi analysis, the pheromone communication layer that underlay Kalithi verbal prosody, and that added dimensions of meaning that verbal analysis alone could not capture. The work required instruments that measured chemical concentrations at levels that human senses could not detect, and the instruments produced data that her Kalithi sensory architecture could interpret with the fluency of someone reading a language she had been born speaking. She was 29 by Kalithi developmental equivalents. She was 5'7", shorter than the Kalithi average, carrying the proportions that her particular genetic expression produced with the comfortable, unself-conscious ease of someone whose relationship with her own physicality was settled, and whose settlement was visible in the way she moved and occupied space. Her skin was a warm twilight violet, lighter than the deep blue tones that some Calithi lineages produced, carrying a luminosity that the workstation's lighting caught and that produced, in Callum's ongoing private observation, a quality that he found compelling and that he had not mentioned because mentioning it would have crossed the professional boundary that their working relationship maintained, and that both of them were, he suspected, increasingly interested in crossing. Her features were expressive, animated by the analytical intelligence that her work required, and by the warmth that her personality provided. A face that communicated engagement and interest with the particular Calithi combination of facial expression and bioluminescent pattern that produced a communication output richer than either channel alone. Her bioluminescent patterns, the chromatic displays along her temples, the bridge of her nose, the line of her jaw, shifted in the warm copper and soft violet that Callum had learned, across 7 months of proximity, to read as her baseline emotional state, engaged, content, and carrying, in the specific warmth of the copper tones, something that her baseline had not contained in the project's early months, and that had developed gradually, and that he recognized because recognizing communicative signals was his profession, and because this particular signal was one he had been watching for. Her eyes were amber, the deep, luminous Calithi coloring that carried the enhanced perception her species' visual architecture provided, and the eyes were, in Callum's professional becoming personal assessment, extraordinary. They were expressive in a way that exceeded their species' standard range, large, warm, carrying the quality of attention that people possessed when they were genuinely interested in what they were looking at, and what they were looking at was, with increasing frequency across 7 months, him. Her hair was dark copper, arranged in the practical style that laboratory work required, and that she maintained with the specific attention that people paid to their appearance when the appearance was being observed by someone whose observation they valued. She was wearing the Calithi variant of the center's standard work clothing, which accommodated Calithi thermal requirements, and which she wore with the particular quality of someone whose awareness of being seen had added a dimension to her self-presentation that the work clothing's neutral design had not anticipated. They worked. The working was the foundation, the daily, sustained collaboration that had produced, across 7 months, both the cultural archive and the mutual understanding that working closely with another person inevitably generated when the other person was interesting, and the work was engaging, and the combination produced the specific alchemy that proximity and shared purpose provided when both elements were present. The prosodic contour in this sample, Vela began, indicating a vocal analysis on her display with the gesture that Calithi used for directing attention, a motion that was simultaneously professional, and in the particular way that she directed it toward Callum, personal. The rising inflection at the terminal boundary. My pheromone analysis shows a corresponding chemical shift that carries emotional emphasis the verbal contour alone doesn't fully express. The verbal is saying, I'm interested. The pheromone layer is saying, I am deeply invested in this outcome. Callum looked at the data. He looked at her. The looking was the habitual moment-long attention that colleagues exchanged during collaborative discussion, and that was, between them, something additional, the looking that carried the accumulated weight of 7 months of looking, and that each look added to. The verbal says one thing, the chemical says more, he said. The vocal expression is the surface, the pheromone is the depth. Yes, we communicate in layers, the verbal is public, the pheromone is, she paused. The pause was not for the word. The pause was for the recognition that the word she was about to use carried personal significance in the context of their conversation, and that the significance was present, and she was choosing to let it be present rather than selecting a more neutral alternative. Private. The words settled between them with the weight that words carried when the words were chosen deliberately and when the choosing was visible. Private. the layer of communication that Calithi reserved for intimate spaces, the layer that the archive documented as the deepest form of Calithi interpersonal exchange, the layer that she was, in this moment, referencing with an awareness that the reference was not purely academic. Private, Callum repeated, and the repetition was acknowledgement, the echo of her word carrying his attention, his recognition of what the word contained, and the mutual awareness that the conversation had shifted from the archive's analysis to the territory that the analysis described. The working day ended. They parted with the composed, professional farewell that their routine had established, and that carried, on this particular day, the additional quality of two people whose parting was temporary, and whose awareness of the temporary was informed by 7 months of accumulation that the next meeting would add to. Callum returned to his quarters. The message was waiting. The message was on his personal channel, the private communication pathway that they had established in the 3rd month of the project when their conversations had extended beyond working hours, and when the extension required a channel that was not monitored by the center's institutional communication logs. The channel's existence was itself evidence of the relationship's trajectory. A private space, built specifically for the purpose of communicating outside the professional framework, the digital equivalent of stepping into a corridor to continue a conversation that the office could not contain. The message was in Calithi, which was not unusual. Vela alternated between Calithi and Standard, depending on the content's emotional register, using Calithi for communications that carried personal weight, and Standard for communications whose content was neutral enough that the language's emotional architecture was unnecessary. The use of Calithi told him, before his translator processed the words, that the content was personal. The translation arrived with the measured, accurate rendering that his translator provided for Calithi communications. I would like you to visit my residence this evening. The archive's prosodic analysis has raised questions about private communication that I believe would benefit from discussion in a private environment. I would value your company. The words were carefully constructed. The surface meaning was professional, a colleague inviting a collaborator to continue a work discussion in a private setting. The construction was deliberate, and the construction was transparent, because 7 months of communication expertise, his human expertise in reading between lines and her Calithi expertise in constructing communications with layered meaning, meant that both of them understood what the message was and what the message was not, and the understanding was mutual, and the mutuality was the point. She was inviting him to her home. The invitation was professional in its framing and personal in its intent. The private communication that the message referenced was not the archive's analytical framework, but the private communication that her species used in intimate contexts. The pheromone layer that she had described as the deep, private layer of Calithi interaction, the layer that required specific environmental conditions to fully express. She was inviting him into the space where that layer was active. She was inviting him into the version of herself that the neutral workspaces of the integration center did not contain, the complete version, the version that communicated with every channel her biology provided, including the channel that only functioned in the atmospheric conditions her home maintained. The invitation was sincere. It was intimate. It was, in the context of 7 months of gradual, mutual progression toward this moment, exactly what Callum had been hoping for. The hope lasted 4 hours. Princess Calith Sorvine found him in the corridor outside his quarters, which was either coincidence or the result of the imperial surveillance access that the princess's position provided, and that her expression communicated she had used for this specific purpose, with the specific justification that the purpose required it. She was the imperial representative overseeing the integration center, a position that placed her in administrative authority over the project and in diplomatic authority over the interspecies interactions the project produced. She was 34 tall, carrying the refined proportions and deep twilight blue pigmentation of imperial lineage, and her expression as she approached Callum carried the particular quality of someone who was about to perform an action they found necessary and unpleasant, and who had calculated the balance between necessity and unpleasantness, and found necessity heavier. Liaison Oren, she said, and the use of his title rather than his name communicated formal register, the linguistic signal that what followed was institutional rather than personal. I need to speak with you, privately. The private office she led him to was a meeting room adjacent to the administrative wing, small, sealed, equipped with the privacy protocols that sensitive diplomatic communications required. The sealing of the door was audible, the mechanical confirmation that the room's contents would not be overheard, and the confirmation communicated that what she was about to say required the protection. You have received an invitation from Analyst Sorthenes, Caliph said. It was not a question. To her residence. How? The how is not relevant, and the how is my prerogative. What is relevant is what the invitation means, and what it will cost you if you accept it without the information I am about to provide. Her bioluminescent patterns were controlled. The steady, deliberate silver blue of someone managing their emotional output to ensure that the communication was clear rather than colored by the feelings the communication was generating. But beneath the control, Callum's 7 months of reading chromatic displays detected something that the control was containing: distress. The princess was distressed, not politically, personally. The distress of someone who was about to hurt someone with information, and who did not want to hurt them, and who was going to do it anyway because the alternative to hurting them was letting them die. Calithi residential atmospheres, Caliph began, and her voice carried the measured, clinical precision of someone delivering medical information, are not equivalent to the atmospheric conditions you experience in shared workspaces, public areas, or neutral environments. Calithi homes maintain atmospheric systems that are specifically configured to support our pheromone communication, the chemical layer that Analyst Sorthenes' work documents, and that constitutes the deepest level of our interpersonal interaction. I'm aware of the pheromone system, the archive. The archive documents the system's communicative function. It does not document the system's atmospheric requirements, because the atmospheric requirements are classified as domestic infrastructure rather than communication data, and because the classification placed the information outside the archive's scope. She paused. The pause was the precision of someone choosing the next words with the care that the next words required. The atmospheric requirements are significant. Calithi residential systems maintain elevated concentrations of the compounds that constitute the pheromone medium. The concentrations are necessary for full-spectrum pheromone communication, the private, intimate communication that functions in domestic environments, and that does not function in the diluted atmospheres of public spaces. The concentrations are another pause, shorter, harder, toxic to humans. The word landed in the sealed room with the specific weight that words carried when the words described something lethal, and the lethal thing was relevant to a decision you were about to make. Toxic, Callum repeated. The specific compounds that facilitate Calithi pheromone communication are neurotoxic to human biology at the concentrations that residential atmospheric systems maintain. The Imperial Medical Directorate's cross-species compatibility data that is not included in standard integration briefings, because its relevance is limited to scenarios that standard integration does not typically produce, documents the effect profile. She met his eyes. The silver-blue composure held, but the distress beneath it was closer to the surface now, visible in the way that contained things were visible when the container was under pressure. Without protective equipment, you would retain consciousness for approximately 15 minutes. Cognitive degradation begins at 10 minutes. Irreversible neurological damage occurs at approximately 30 minutes. Respiratory failure at 45 minutes to 1 hour. The room was quiet. The quiet was the acoustic environment that sealed rooms produced when the sounds that usually occupied spaces, ambient noise, environmental systems, the presence of other people, were absent, and when the absence made the quiet feel structural rather than empty. Vela doesn't know this, Callum said. Analyst Sorthenes has no reason to know this. The incompatibility exists in a category of biological data that her professional training does not include, and that her personal experience has not required. She has worked beside you for 7 months in environments that are, because to her biology the compounds are not hazardous, they are essential. The atmospheric conditions of her home are to her the conditions of intimacy, the conditions of being fully herself, the conditions that she is inviting you to share. And the sharing would kill me. Within an hour. And she would not understand what was happening because the symptoms of human neurotoxic exposure, cognitive impairment, disorientation, respiratory distress, would register to her perception not as poisoning, but as emotional responses she might interpret as discomfort, rejection, or cultural misunderstanding. She would not recognize that you were dying because her framework for interpreting human behavior does not include the category of dying from my home atmosphere, and the category's absence would cause her to misinterpret the evidence until the evidence was fatal. Callum sat in the sealed office with the information the princess had provided, and the information occupied the space in his understanding that the invitation had occupied 4 hours ago. And the occupation was a replacement. The anticipation that the invitation had generated replaced by the knowledge that the invitation's fulfillment would have been his death, delivered in the most intimate space available to the woman he had been falling for, and the death would have been incomprehensible to her because her biology could not perceive the mechanism. I cannot intervene in the invitation, Caliph said. My authority as project overseer extends to professional interactions. Personal invitations between consenting adults are outside my institutional mandate. I cannot order her to withdraw the invitation. I cannot order you to decline. I can only ensure that you possess the information required to make your decision with full awareness of its consequences. You're telling me so I don't die. I am telling you because the alternative is a human dying in a Calithi residence, and the death being attributed to rejection or incompatibility rather than atmospheric toxicity. And the attribution would damage every integration initiative the framework supports and would destroy analyst Sorthenes in ways that I am not prepared to permit when prevention is possible. The princess's concern was dual, institutional, and personal. The institutional dimension was visible in the diplomatic calculation that her position required. The personal dimension was visible in the way she spoke Vela's name, the specific care that the name carried, the concern of someone who was protecting not just the framework's interests, but a person whose destruction she was not willing to allow. I need to tell her, Callum said, that is your decision. It's not a decision. It's the only option. She invited me into her home, into the most intimate space her biology provides. She did it because she wants to share that space with me, and the space would kill me. She has to know. Not knowing, leaving her believing that I declined because I wasn't interested, or accepting and dying in her home without her understanding why. Both of those are worse than the truth. The truth will hurt her. The truth hurts. The alternatives kill me literally, her understanding of what happened metaphorically. The truth is the option where everyone survives. Calith's bioluminescent patterns shifted, the silver-blue composure giving way, for a moment, to something warmer. Not the warm copper of Vela's displays, but the deep gold that Callum's 7 months of chromatic literacy recognized as respect. The specific Calithi chromatic expression of encountering a response that exceeded the expected, and that the exceeding warranted acknowledgement. You are more than I expected from a cultural liaison, she said. I'm a communication specialist. Communication means telling people things they need to hear even when the telling is hard, especially when the telling is hard. He found Vela in the archive room, the shared workspace where 7 months of collaboration had built the foundation that had led to the invitation that had led to the princess's warning that had led to this moment. And the moment was the hardest thing his communication career had required of him, because the communication he was about to deliver was not an analysis or a briefing or a report, but a conversation with a woman whose invitation he wanted to accept and whose invitation would kill him, and whose knowledge of the killing was the information he was carrying into the room. She looked up when he entered. The look was the look that 7 months had built, warm, attentive, carrying the specific quality of someone who was pleased to see the person entering, and whose pleasure was communicated through every channel her biology provided. Facial expression, bioluminescent display, and the subtle, undetectable to human chemical signals that her pheromone system produced at the diluted concentrations that the neutral workspace permitted. The look was the look of someone who had issued an invitation, and who was, in the hours since the issuing, anticipating the response with the particular combination of hope and vulnerability that intimate invitations generated in every species, and that was, in this moment, visible in the warm copper of her bioluminescent patterns and the openness of her amber eyes. Vela, he said, and her name in his voice carried the weight of what he was about to say, and the weight was audible, and she heard it. Her patterns shifted. The warm copper dimmed, not to darkness, but to the attentive, cautious register that people entered when they heard something in a voice that indicated the next words would be significant in a direction they had not anticipated. Your invitation, he said. I want to accept it. I want you to know that. I want to accept it in the way that you intended it, and the intention is, I want the same thing you want. I have wanted it for months. The work, the conversations, the way I want this. Then, I can't accept it, not because I don't want to, because your home would kill me. The sentence landed in the archive room, with the weight of a sentence that contained a word that the context made devastating. Kill. The word was human, blunt, direct, carrying the specific Anglo-Saxon impact that the English language deployed when its Germanic roots provided the word that the situation required rather than the Latinate euphemism that softer situations permitted. The translation rendered it in Calithi with equivalent force, and the force was visible in the way Vela's bioluminescent patterns responded. A rapid cascade that cycled through confusion, alarm, and the specific color that Callum had learned to identify as the Calithi expression of encountering information that restructured the framework through which you understood the world. He explained. He explained with the care and the thoroughness that 7 months of communication expertise and 7 months of caring about the person he was communicating with demanded. The atmospheric compounds, the concentrations, the neurotoxic effect on human biology, the 15-minute consciousness window, the irreversible damage threshold, the fatal endpoint. He explained with the clinical precision that the information required, and the personal warmth that the relationship required. And the combination of both was the hardest communicative act he had ever performed because the information was devastating, and the warmth was genuine, and delivering both simultaneously required, holding two things that pulled in opposite directions without dropping either one. Vela listened. Her bioluminescent patterns moved through a progression that Callum watched with the helpless attention of a man who was watching the person he cared about process pain, and whose expertise in reading the processing could not mitigate the pain itself. Confusion, comprehension, horror, the specific, sharp chromatic expression of someone realizing that the most intimate space they possessed was lethal to the person they wanted to share it with, that the invitation they had offered with genuine affection was, in its mechanical reality, an invitation to die. I didn't know, she said, and her voice was thin, the vocal quality of someone whose emotional processing was consuming the resources that vocal production required. The compounds, I breathed them. They're home. They're what home is. The pheromone layer, the communication that I wanted to share with you, it's carried in those compounds. The intimacy is in those compounds. Everything I wanted you to experience, the full version of how I communicate, the complete version of who I am, is in an atmosphere that my body can't survive. Yes, the word was a sound that carried more weight than a single syllable should have been able to hold. The thing I wanted to give you, the complete me, the version that exists in the space where I am fully myself, is the thing that would destroy you. The archive room held the silence that followed. The silence was full of the understanding that both of them had arrived at simultaneously, and that the understanding was the cruelest kind. Not misunderstanding, not incompatibility of personality or culture or desire, but the brute, mechanical fact that her biology required an environment that his biology could not tolerate. And the requirement was not flexible, and the intolerance was not negotiable, and the wanting, the mutual, genuine. 7 months in the making wanting could not alter the biochemistry that made the wanting physically impossible to fulfill in the way that the wanting most wanted to be fulfilled. I can't invite you into who I am, Vela said, and the words carried the specific devastation of someone articulating a loss that they were only now understanding, and that the understanding was making real. The version of me that I wanted you to know, the private, intimate, complete version, exists in an environment that is poison to you. I am, in my deepest expression, toxic to the person I. No, Callum's voice was firm. Not loud, firm. The firmness of someone who was hearing a conclusion being drawn and who was intervening before the conclusion could set. You are not toxic. The atmosphere is toxic. You are not your atmosphere. The compounds are infrastructure. They are the medium that carries your communication. You are the person who communicates, and the person who communicates is someone he stopped. Not because the sentence had no ending, but because the ending was significant and the significance deserved precision. Is someone I want to know, all of you. And if the knowing requires finding ways that don't involve me dying in your living room, then we find ways. What ways? The pheromone layer is it's not optional. It's not a setting I adjust. It's how I express her patterns pulsed, the warm copper fighting through the distress. It's how I would tell you things that words don't carry. It's how I would show you what I feel. Without it, you get the verbal and the visual. You get the surface. You don't get. I get you. Whatever version of you can exist in the spaces we can share, I get you. The version I've known for 7 months. The version that works beside me, that explains pheromone contours with that look in her eyes, that uses Kalithy on the personal channel because the words carry more when they carry in your language. That version is not the surface. That version is a person I have been falling for since the 2nd month, and who I am not going to lose because the air in her apartment is trying to murder me. The phrasing was human. The phrasing was specifically, characteristically, defiantly human. The application of irreverent directness to a devastating situation. The refusal to let the devastation's weight crush the response beneath solemnity. The insistence on finding, even in the worst moment, the angle that was honest and warm and slightly, deliberately, absurdly defiant of the thing that was trying to be tragic. Vela's patterns shifted. The distress did not disappear. The distress was real. The loss was real. The knowledge that the most intimate space she possessed was barred to the person she wanted in it was a wound that would not heal quickly. But through the distress, something else emerged. A color that Callum had not seen before. Not the warm copper of contentment, not the bright gold of delight, but something between them. A hue that the chromatic vocabulary he had built across 7 months did not contain, and that was therefore new, produced by an emotional state that was new, the state of a person experiencing loss and hope simultaneously, and finding that the hope was, despite the loss, viable. The air in my apartment is trying to murder you, she repeated, and the repetition was not grief. The repetition was the echo of his phrasing, adopted into her voice, carrying the same defiant warmth that his phrasing had carried. The Kalithy voice finding the human rhythm and inhabiting it because the rhythm was what the moment needed, and the needing was mutual. Aggressively, Callum confirmed. Enthusiastically, with chemical determination. I live in a chemical murder room. You live in a beautiful chemical murder room that facilitates the deepest expression of your emotional communication, and that also happens to dissolve human neurology. These things are both true. Both true, she looked at him. The amber eyes were bright, not with the contained moisture that grief produced in species that expressed grief through tears, because Calithi did not, but with the bioluminescent intensity that her species produced when the emotion behind the eyes exceeded the eye's capacity to express it through color alone, producing a luminous quality that was, even in this moment, beautiful. Both true, and we find the spaces that work. We find the version of this that doesn't kill me. We find the ways that your communication reaches me that don't require me breathing neurotoxins. We find he reached across the space between them. The reaching was deliberate, his hand extended toward hers, the gesture carrying the specific, universal meaning that physical contact carried when the contact was offered with care and with the intent to connect. We find this, whatever this is, in whatever spaces this can exist in. She took his hand. The contact was the contact of two people whose species' communication systems operated on different channels, and whose channels were, in this moment, converging on the single channel that both species shared. Touch, skin against skin, the warmth of contact, the physical expression of connection that did not require pheromones or bioluminescence or linguistic construction, but that communicated, through the simple mechanism of one person holding another person's hand, the thing that all communication systems were designed to carry, and that the simplest systems carried most clearly. I can wear atmospheric protection, Callum said, for limited visits. The princess, or the medical directorate, can provide equipment that filters the compounds. The visits would be restricted. The experience would be incomplete. You'd be communicating in full spectrum. I'd be receiving the verbal and the visual through a protective mask, but I'd be there, in your space, seeing the version of you that exists there, even if I'm experiencing it through a filter. A filter, an imperfect solution to an imperfect situation, but present, in the space that matters to you, seeing me through a mask that prevents you from dying. The romance of the scenario is not its strongest feature. I acknowledge this. The sound that Vela produced was not laughter. Calithi vocal architecture did not produce laughter in the human configuration. It was the Calithi equivalent, a harmonic shift in her voice that carried the same emotional content, the involuntary vocal expression of something that was simultaneously painful and absurd, and that the absurdity made bearable because the absurdity was shared. The sharing was the point. The sharing had always been the point. 7 months of sharing work and conversations, and the gradual, mutual progression toward something more. And the something more had encountered a barrier that was not philosophical or cultural but chemical. And the chemical barrier was real and permanent and devastating. And the sharing continued despite it, because the sharing was what they had chosen, and the choosing was stronger than the chemistry. We do this, she said. Her hand held his. Her bioluminescent patterns were the new color, the one between copper and gold, the one that loss and hope produced together. We do this in the spaces we can share. And in the spaces we cannot, we find the closest thing to sharing that the spaces permit. And the closest thing is enough, Callum said. The closest thing is enough because the closest thing includes us, and us is the part that matters. The archive room held them. The neutral atmosphere, the shared, breathable, non-lethal air that the workspace maintained, surrounded them with the environmental conditions that both species could survive in. And the conditions were not the deep intimacy of Vela's home, and not the uncomplicated comfort of Callum's, but the middle ground, the space between, the territory that was neither fully hers nor fully his but theirs. And the theirs was what they had, and the theirs was, in its imperfection and its limitation, and its stubborn, defiant, absurd existence in the face of biochemical incompatibility. Enough.